1921. On the surface, everything still looked intact. The buildings, the production lines, the roads that carried his name. But inside, an empire had just vanished. Frank Seiberling was, at that moment, the founder of the largest tire company on Earth. His personal wealth was estimated at more than $100 million. Presidents sought his counsel. Bankers regarded him as a symbol of American industrial power. And then, within 6 months, everything changed hands. There was no loud bankruptcy, no public confrontation, no dramatic headlines, only paperwork, signatures, and the quiet closing of a boardroom door. Frank Seiberling walked away from the company he had built at the age of 62, with nothing, except his name. And strangely, as the rubber empire collapsed in silence, Stan Hewitt still stood. A house so vast it barely felt like a home at all. A place built with money, power, and perhaps a belief that something should endure longer than a single lifetime. This is not simply a story of success and failure. It is a story about what remains when everything else is gone. If you are wondering how a man who lost everything could leave behind a legacy that would touch millions of lives, stay with us. Take a moment to like and subscribe, so you don't miss these stories of history told in a way few dare to tell. Because to understand how Frank Seiberling lost everything in silence, we have to go back much further. Back to a time when he had nothing but an abandoned factory, a debt he could barely afford, and a belief that America itself was not yet ready to share. Broke at 38. In the late 1890s, the United States entered a period when families once thought untouchable disappeared within just a few years. A series of financial panics collapsed banks, railroads, and young industrial businesses across the country. The Seiberling family stood directly in the path of that collapse. Frank Seiberling was born into a family that had once been prosperous. His father, John Seiberling, was a successful manufacturer of agricultural machinery in Ohio. For years, the family lived on the stability of industry, on a future Frank assumed he would one day inherit. Then it vanished. After the financial crises of the late 19th century, his father's businesses failed. The skills Frank had spent years developing bookkeeping, accounting, managing a functioning company, suddenly had no place to go. There was no company left to run. No familiar industry to return to. That year, Frank Seiberling was 38 years old. By the standards of the time, this was no longer the age to start over. He had a wife, Gertrude, and 3 young children. No meaningful savings. No new job waiting. In the late 19th century, being unemployed at 38 was not a statistic. It was a social sentence. And yet, at that moment, a detail most people would have ignored came into view. On the east side of Akron, Ohio, stood an abandoned strawboard factory. The building sat on 7 acres of land, unused and unattended. Inside were the smells of long dampness, rodents, and outdated machinery, with no remaining commercial value. The asking price for the entire property was $13,500, roughly the equivalent of $450,000 today. Frank Seiberling did not have $13,000. He did not even have $1,000. But he saw something others did not. Akron already had rubber companies operating for years. Workers in the city knew how to process raw rubber, how to shape it, vulcanize it, and repair rubber products. It was a ready labor force, unemployed, waiting to be hired. Frank Seiberling went to his brother-in-law, Lucius Miles. He did not present a polished business plan. He asked for $3,500 to make a down payment on the factory. $3,500 in 1898 was a serious sum. More than $100,000 in modern terms. Miles agreed to lend the money, sharing the risk. With that loan, Frank Seiberling purchased an empty factory. No new machinery, no workers, no customers, no products. Only a building and an assumption that automobiles were coming, that America would not always move by horse, and that when that future arrived, the country would need rubber, lots of rubber. In 1898, most Americans had never seen an automobile in person. This belief was not a trend. It was a gamble, and for Frank Seiberling, it was no longer a business decision. It was a decision of survival. But what belief could convince a man nearing 40, with no capital and no new profession, to stake his entire family on a future America itself was not yet certain would exist? The Goodyear Gamble. In the summer of 1898, Frank Seiberling faced a decision that would later define the fate of his company from its very first day. It was not a choice of product, not a choice of market. It was the choice of a name. The name he chose was Charles Goodyear. Charles Goodyear was not a successful businessman. He was the inventor of rubber vulcanization, the process of combining rubber with sulfur under heat to create a material that was durable, elastic, and usable at industrial scale. That discovery became the foundation of the modern rubber industry. Yet Goodyear never truly profited from his invention. He spent much of his life in debt, locked in lawsuits, watching his possessions seized. When he died in 1860, he left behind patents that had changed the world, but almost no money. According to several contemporary accounts, his family could not even afford a proper gravestone. Naming a company after such a man was not a safe choice. The name carried the image of brilliance crushed by the marketplace. But in that story, Frank Seiberling saw a reflection of himself. A man with an idea, a man without capital, and a man the market was not yet ready to reward. On August 29, 1898, Frank Seiberling and his brother Charles Seiberling officially incorporated the company. Frank was not its first president. That title went to an investor who contributed $30,000 in capital, nearly $1 million in today's value. Frank took the role of secretary and general manager, overseeing the company's daily operations. The company's first products were not automobile tires. In 1898, automobiles were still unfamiliar to most Americans. Instead, the factory produced bicycle tires, rubber tubes for horse-drawn carriages, and rubber pads fitted to horseshoes to prevent slipping. These were small products with thin margins, but they were enough to keep the factory running. Then the threat appeared almost immediately. The carriage tire industry was dominated by the Consolidated Tire Company, a powerful firm that controlled a web of critical patents. Consolidated claimed exclusive rights to manufacture and sell carriage tires in the United States. Any company entering the market risked being sued. Goodyear did not have the money to survive a prolonged legal battle. But Frank Seiberling also could not retreat. He chose to fight. The lawsuit dragged on for nearly 2 years. During that time, every dollar of profit from Goodyear's carriage tire business was frozen and placed in escrow. The money could not be touched. The factory still had to pay wages. The machines still had to run. His family still had to survive. This was the moment when the company could have collapsed not from lack of orders, but from lack of cash. A single loss in court would have erased Goodyear before it ever became a recognized name. Eventually, the court ruled. Consolidated Tire was found to have used its patents to illegally restrict competition. Goodyear was allowed to continue manufacturing. The frozen funds were released. The company survived its first test. But survival was only the minimum requirement. It still did not answer the larger question. Could a company that had just escaped death through a legal ruling dare to dream bigger? Or would it choose safety over ambition and simply exist? The Little Napoleon. At the dawn of the 20th century, America began to change the way it moved. Roads, once shaped by horse hooves, started to welcome something unfamiliar: the automobile. Frank Seiberling did not invent the car, but he was among the first to understand that if the automobile became the future of transportation, then tires would become the bloodstream of that entire system. In the early years, automobile tires were a constant frustration. Mounting and removal required specialized tools. A single puncture could end a journey. Drivers complained more than they enjoyed the ride. Frank Seiberling saw the problem before the market fully recognized it. In 1901, Goodyear introduced the straight-side tire. Unlike earlier designs, it used a braided steel wire bead to lock the tire securely to the rim. It was easier to remove, more durable, more stable on the road. This was not a minor improvement. It transformed the tire from a fragile nuisance into a dependable component. But product innovation alone was not enough. Frank Seiberling understood that to dominate an industry, he could not rely on hand craftsmanship. Manual production was slow, inconsistent, and expensive. To scale, Goodyear would have to change how the entire industry worked. In 1908, working alongside Chief Engineer William State, he introduced an automated tire building machine. Before this, a worker could produce only a limited number of tires per day. With the new machine, output increased more than tenfold. Costs fell sharply. Quality became uniform. By 1913, more than half of all tires manufactured in the United States were produced on machines based on this design. And it was at this moment that a decisive partnership formed. In Detroit, Henry Ford was preparing to launch the Model T, not a luxury vehicle for the wealthy, but a car for ordinary working Americans. To achieve that, Ford needed tires that were inexpensive, durable, and delivered on schedule in massive quantities. Goodyear could deliver all three. Beginning in 1908, Goodyear tires rolled off the assembly lines mounted on Model T automobiles. As Ford increased production, Goodyear expanded alongside him. The explosion of the automobile industry triggered an equally dramatic demand for rubber. But Frank Seiberling did not limit his vision to the road. When early flights proved that humans could leave the ground, Goodyear moved into aviation tires and rubberized fabrics for aircraft. Soon followed pneumatic truck tires, replacing the solid rubber tires that had exhausted drivers and damaged cargo on long hauls. If something required rubber to move, Goodyear intended to be there. Yet Seiberling's power did not reside solely within factory walls. He understood that an industrial empire could only endure if the people running it had stable lives. Akron's population was growing faster than its housing supply. Workers poured in, but places to live did not. Frank Seiberling personally financed the construction of Goodyear Heights for factory workers. Homes designed to be purchased over time, not rented temporarily. Then came Fairlawn Heights, built for engineers and managers he did not want competitors to lure away. This was not just housing. It was a strategy to secure loyalty. By 1910, Akron was no longer a provincial city. It had acquired a new identity, the rubber capital of the world. In boardrooms across the industry, Frank Seiberling was not physically imposing. He did not dominate conversations with volume. Yet competitors began calling him by a nickname, the Little Napoleon. Not because of his stature, but because of his ability to see further than everyone else. Others made tires for the present. Frank Seiberling made tires for roads that did not yet exist. And when a man controls the technology, the market, the workforce, and an entire city that moves in sync with his vision, is that power enough? Or is he already reaching towards something even greater? Building Stan Highway. As Frank Seiberling's industrial power extended beyond the factory gates, a different question began to surface. Not how many more tires he could produce, but what would remain when those production lines eventually stopped. Around 1909, Frank Seiberling began purchasing land on the west side of Akron. At the time, the area was still farmland and rolling hills, far removed from industrial smoke and noise. Through a series of incremental acquisitions, the property gradually expanded into a large estate. Among these parcels was an unusual feature, an abandoned stone quarry. Its ground hollowed out, leaving a void that most developers would have tried to conceal or fill. Frank Seiberling did neither. He looked at the emptiness and treated it as a foundation. In 1912, Frank traveled to England with his wife Gertrude and architect Charles Schneider. The journey came at a time when America's elite favored French chateaux and Italian palazzos. But Seiberling was not searching for continental grandeur. They toured a number of historic English estates, particularly Tudor manor houses. Buildings that were not perfectly symmetrical, shaped by generations rather than a single plan, rooted deeply in the land around them. These homes were not designed to impress instantly. They were built to endure. That journey defined everything that followed. Upon returning to Ohio, Frank Seiberling named the future home Stan Hewitt, a term derived from Old English, meaning stone quarry or quarried stone. The name bound the house directly to the hollowed ground beneath it. The mansion was not placed on the highest hill. It rose from the very place where the earth had once been taken away. The design required nearly 3,000 detailed architectural drawings. Every wall, every window, every timber was planned in advance. The volume of materials was so great that a temporary railroad spur had to be constructed, allowing stone, timber, and steel to be delivered directly to the site. Construction began in 1912 and continued for 3 years. When completed, Stan Hewitt contained 65 rooms and approximately 64,000 square feet of space. It was larger than most luxury hotels in America at the time. The total cost of construction and furnishings reached into the millions of dollars by early 20th century standards, equivalent to tens of millions today. Yet the most significant detail had nothing to do with scale. Above the front entrance, Frank Seiberling had a Latin phrase carved into stone, "Non nobis solum," not for us alone. It was not a marketing slogan. It was placed where every visitor was forced to see it upon entry. In late 1915, the Seiberling family moved into Stan Highway, while portions of the work were still unfinished. The house became a lived space, filled with routine, conversation, and daily life behind its stone walls. Stan Highway was not built to prove how wealthy Frank Seiberling had become. It was built to express a different idea of power. But did Frank Seiberling's ambition truly end on land? Or was Stan Hewitt only the beginning of a vision that would reach far beyond what he had just constructed. Power and tragedy. By 1911, Frank Seiberling's ambition no longer stopped at the ground. If rubber could help people move faster across land, the next question was whether it could carry them across oceans through the air. That idea did not emerge in isolation. Only 8 years earlier, the Wright brothers' first powered flight had changed how humanity looked at the sky. Inventors, engineers, and financiers began to believe that air travel was not a fantasy, but the next inevitable step. Frank Seiberling chose to take part. In 1911, he financed a bold project known as the Akron Airship, intended to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Goodyear was responsible for producing the rubberized fabric envelope, an area the company was eager to develop. From a technical standpoint, the move made sense. From a risk standpoint, it was something entirely different. On the morning of July 2, 1912, in Atlantic City, New Jersey, thousands of people gathered along the beach and boardwalk. Estimates suggest as many as 20,000 spectators looked up at the sky. Among them were the wives of the crew members, standing beneath the sun, waiting for history to begin. The Akron lifted from the ground and moved out over the water. For the first few minutes, everything appeared to be proceeding as planned. Then, disaster struck. At an altitude of roughly 500 feet, a violent explosion tore through the airship. Hydrogen ignited. The envelope ruptured. Flames engulfed the control gondola. Burning debris fell toward the ocean as thousands watched in disbelief. The airship plunged into the shallow waters offshore. Every member of the crew was killed. There were no survivors. The exact cause of the explosion was never fully determined. Some reports suggested excessive hydrogen pressure ruptured the envelope. Others pointed to structural failure or electrical friction. The theories varied. The outcome did not. Ambition had collided with the limits of human life. In the aftermath, Goodyear halted all airship projects for many years. The company refocused on businesses that delivered reliable returns. The path to the sky was temporarily closed. And yet, the contradiction was unmistakable. While the Akron tragedy still haunted public memory, Frank Seiberling's rubber empire continued to expand. Just 2 years later, the First World War erupted in Europe and soon drew the United States into its machinery. War created an unprecedented demand for rubber. Military truck tires, aircraft tires, rubberized fabrics for observation balloons and military equipment. Goodyear became a critical industrial pillar of the wartime economy. By the end of the war, the company was producing thousands of tires each day. Revenue and workforce numbers rose to levels the company had never seen before. At this point, Frank Seiberling's power was no longer that of a manufacturer alone. It was tied directly to the fate of a wartime economy. For the first time, Frank Seiberling's ambition did not fall onto balance sheets. It fell into the sea. And when the war ended, when military orders disappeared, could an empire built in wartime survive in peace? Or would that very success become the seed of an even greater collapse waiting just ahead? The collapse. When the guns of the First World War fell silent, another kind of silence spread across American factories. Military orders disappeared. Emergency contracts ended. The urgency that had driven wartime production evaporated. In 1920, the United States entered a brief but severe economic downturn. Consumer demand collapsed. Inventories piled up. Companies that had expanded to their limits during the war suddenly felt the true weight of their own size. Goodyear was among them. During the war years, The company had taken on massive debt to expand plants, secure raw materials, and increase capacity. When the war ended, those debts did not vanish with the contracts. They remained, with real interest rates and unforgiving repayment schedules. Goodyear's revenue fell sharply in a matter of months. From more than $200 million annually at the wartime peak, sales dropped to nearly half that figure. Financial reports from the early 1920s show losses measured in the millions, equivalent to tens of millions of dollars today. The stock market reacted immediately. Goodyear's preferred shares, once trading at $100 per share, fell to around $20. Common stock, which had sold for more than $130, collapsed to nearly worthless levels. On paper, Frank Seiberling still controlled an empire with assets spread across the United States and overseas. In reality, he lacked the cash required to meet short-term obligations. This was the paradox of scale, not a shortage of assets, a shortage of liquidity. Banks began to intervene. In 1920 and 1921, a consortium of New York banks and financial institutions moved to restructure Goodyear's debt. In exchange, they demanded deeper control over the company. Goodyear would be saved, but ownership would change. During negotiations, Frank Seiberling was asked to remain. As an executive or symbolic figure, he could help reassure markets and employees alike. The founder's presence still carried weight. Frank Seiberling refused. He would not run a company he no longer controlled. He would not sign decisions imposed by others. He would not stay to occupy a ceremonial seat. In 1921, Frank Seiberling walked away from Goodyear. After 23 years of building it from nothing, he left at the age of 62. He lost the company, but he kept his honor. Some men sell their souls to remain in power. Frank Seiberling chose to walk away. And when a 62-year-old man steps out of the empire he built with his own hands, with no power, no liquid assets, and no official position, what, if anything, does he still have left to begin again? Starting over. In 1921, Frank Seiberling walked away from the company he had spent 23 years building. He was 62 years old. He no longer held control. He had no significant liquid assets, and he no longer occupied any official position in the industry he once dominated. Yet there was one thing no bank could seize: reputation. Years earlier, Frank Seiberling had helped a friend named Edgar Davis. When Davis was facing financial difficulty, Seiberling loaned him $57,000. At early 20th century values, that sum equaled more than $1 million today. Davis later moved to Texas, entered the oil business, and became wealthy. When Frank Seiberling lost everything, Davis remembered the debt. In late 1921, Davis provided Frank and his brother Charles Seiberling with approximately $500,000 in capital, an enormous sum in the aftermath of the economic downturn. Enough to begin again, not enough to fail. Frank Seiberling chose to purchase the Portage Rubber Company in Barberton, Ohio. A factory roughly 10 years old, neither modern nor glamorous, but technically sound. On November 21, 1921, the Seiberling Rubber Company was officially formed. The company began with roughly 200 employees, not tens of thousands as at Goodyear. No advantage of scale, no privileged market position. Then something unexpected happened. Many workers who had once worked under Frank at Goodyear returned, not because the wages were higher, but because they trusted the man behind the factory. At dinner gatherings at Stan Hewitt, Frank Sieberling told his associates that he wanted the name Sieberling on rubber to mean what the word sterling meant on silver. Not the largest, but the most reliable. That strategy quickly showed results. Sieberling rubber focused on tires for trucks, buses, tractors, and heavy machinery. Segments where durability and trust mattered more than flashy advertising. The company introduced technical improvements such as sawtooth tread patterns and heat venting systems designed to extend tire life. Within 6 years, Sieberling rubber rose from beyond 300th place in the industry to rank among the 7 largest tire manufacturers in the United States. A leap few young companies of the era ever achieved. The company's slogan appeared in advertisements and on packaging, "A name you can trust in rubber." Frank Sieberling gradually stepped back from daily operations. His son, J. Penfield Sieberling, assumed leadership. Frank remained chairman until retiring in 1950, at the age of 90. After decades of operation, Sieberling rubber was eventually sold to Firestone in 1965 for more than $30 million. The Sieberling name slowly disappeared from American roadways, but Frank Sieberling's story does not end there. Not everyone gets a second chance. And Frank Sieberling's greatest legacy was not found in rubber. So if it was not tires, what was the true legacy he left behind? One that continues to change millions of lives to this day. The Gate Lodge, 1935. As the United States was still struggling through the Great Depression, a man from New York arrived in Akron with nowhere left to go. His name was Bill Wilson, a former stockbroker, a well-educated man, and a severe alcoholic. Wilson had come to Akron to take part in a proxy fight involving a rubber machinery company. The deal collapsed. The money ran out. He found himself stranded in the city with only a few dollars in his pocket. The most dangerous thing was not the lack of money. It was the pull of his addiction returning. Bill Wilson had managed a short period of sobriety through his involvement with the Oxford Group, a religious movement centered on self-examination and helping others. But standing in a hotel lobby in Akron, hearing the clink of glasses and smelling alcohol from the bar nearby, he knew how close he was to drinking again. Wilson understood one thing clearly. If he stayed alone, he would drink. If he spoke to another alcoholic, he might survive the night. So he began making phone calls. Those calls eventually led him to one name, Henrietta Sieberling, the daughter-in-law of Frank Sieberling, a woman who knew intimately the pain of living alongside alcoholism. Henrietta had been trying to help a local surgeon named Robert Smith, known to most as Dr. Bob. Bob Smith was a respected physician whose alcoholism had repeatedly pushed his career and family to the edge of collapse. On Sunday, May 12, 1935, Henrietta arranged for the two men to meet at the Gate Lodge, a small house located at the entrance to the Stan Hewitt estate. There were no elegant furnishings, no speeches, no moral instruction. Just two men sitting across from each other, telling the truth. Bill Wilson spoke about losing control, about shame, about the sense of powerlessness over alcohol. Dr. Bob listened. For the first time, Bob Smith was not hearing advice from someone who did not understand. He was hearing his own life described by another man. The conversation lasted for hours. It did not cure either of them instantly, but it accomplished something more important. It shattered isolation. On June 10, 1935, Dr. Bob took his last drink. From that day forward, he never drank again. What followed was not planned as a global movement. Wilson and Smith simply recognized one truth. To keep their own sobriety, they would have to help others like themselves. Alcoholics Anonymous was born from that realization. Built on anonymity, honest sharing, and mutual aid among those who had reached the bottom. The Gate Lodge, a place never intended to make history, gradually became a site of pilgrimage for millions around the world. Each year, people in recovery return to Akron to remember the meeting that changed their lives. History does not begin in palaces. It begins where people dare to admit their weakness. And here lies the paradox. The most far-reaching legacy connected to the Seiberling family did not begin in a factory, nor inside Stan Hewitt itself, but in a small house where two broken men chose honesty over denial. Yet this still is not the final chapter in the story of Frank Seiberling's legacy. Non nobis solum. As Frank Seiberling entered the final years of his life, industrial power was no longer in his hands, but his footprints remained. Land that once belonged to a rubber empire was given back as public parks. Money he set aside helped build hospitals for the community. Places that had once been private assets slowly became shared spaces. In 1955, Frank Seiberling died at the age of 95. He was no longer the richest man, no longer the owner of a global corporation. But neither was he a man defined by failure. 2 years later, his children made a decision. They did not keep Stan Hewitt for themselves. The house was donated to the public, its doors open to the community. A space once reserved for power and privacy became a place of shared memory. Stan Hewitt was designated a National Historic Landmark, not because of its size alone, but because of the stories that unfolded within its walls. And that story did not end with one generation. Frank Seiberling's grandson, John Seiberling, devoted much of his life to a different kind of battle, not in factories, but in Congress. He played a central role in protecting more than 100 million acres of natural land across the United States, one of the largest environmental legacies in the nation's history. The Latin phrase carved above the entrance of Stan Hewitt still remains, non nobis solum, not for us alone. Frank Seiberling did not leave behind an empire. He left a space, a place where the most important things could happen. And perhaps that is the question this story leaves us with today. When power, wealth, and reputation can vanish within a single generation, what truly remains in the end? If you are drawn to stories about grand houses, the people who built them, and the invisible legacies hidden behind history's polished surfaces, the videos appearing on your screen will take you even deeper into that world, with perspectives that may surprise you. Take a moment to like, subscribe, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the legacy Frank Seiberling left behind. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Until the next journey.